Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. My name is Sam Johnson. I'm the Managing Director at Impact Policy. Before we go any further, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge country. We're recording this episode today on Bidjigal country. I want to take a moment to pay my deepest respects to our elders, both past and present. I want to extend that respect to any other mob that are tuning in today, watching or listening to this as well. I want to recognise that wherever you're consuming this content today, across the many different lands and nations across this country and abroad, you're on Aboriginal land. So I want to pay my deepest respects to the countries on which you're consuming this content from today as well. Impact Policy is an Aboriginal-owned and led organisation. We work really closely, mostly with the public sector, particularly around co-design, engagement, consultation and research. And today I'm really privileged to be joined by someone who I really highly respect in the planning and policy space, Ed Wensing, and I'll give you a space to tell the world a little bit more about yourself in a moment. We've had an opportunity to be connected for some time now. Been a large fan of your work, big supporter of, I guess, everything that you've really drove and stood for throughout your career. And I think so many people are going to get so much out of being able to tune in and listen to the power of that story and that journey, the lessons learned, and I guess where we go to from here and the things we're still sort of wrestling with today from a policy perspective and more broader as well. So I might pause there and I might hand it to yourself to formally introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit more about your background too.
Yeah. Hi, Sam. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your very kind words. I live in Canberra. I live on the Ngambri, Ngunnawal, Ngaraga country. There's more than one Aboriginal group has connections to the ACT and surrounds. It might even be four, in fact. I'm very privileged to be working and living in the National Capital, where I've grown up, spent all my life.
Most recently, I think we connected at the Planning Institute of Australia conference in Wollongong.
We did.
We do some work as part of a knowledge circle group that's connected to PIA as well. But I think maybe for people listening, it might be helpful to maybe hear a bit about your journey and story in this sort of space. Maybe a bit about sort of where you started, some of the impact that you had early in your career, particularly around Aboriginal policy and things like that, but maybe more broader as well.
Well, I had the privilege in the mid-90s to be appointed through a competitive process to take up the inaugural national policy director for the then Royal Australian Planning Institute in 1996, early 1996. And in that role, the board had given me directions to write policy statements on a dozen or so topics. One of those topics was native title. The other topics were all to do with planning, whether it be new urban development, transport planning, social planning, environmental planning, planning law, environmental impact statements, cultural heritage generally. But the last one on the list was native title. And I remembered when I'd taken up the job that a colleague, it might have been at one of the Planning Institute conferences, had given me a piece of paper with his phone number on it and said, if you've got to do anything on native title, Ed, give me a call. Well, of course, I'd lost a bit of paper.
as you do at a conference generally.
So I called David Winterbottom, who was, I think, the then president of the New South Wales division, because I knew he'd come from Sydney. And I said to David, one of your colleagues gave me a piece of paper with this instruction. Can you track him down, please? And we did. We tracked him down. That was John Sheehan. John at that time was an English-trained planner and valuer. Yeah. Been in Australia for a number of years. He was also an active member of the then Australian Institute of Valuers and Land Economists, now called the Australian Property Institute, API. We teamed up. We got on really well together. The other thing that I did in response to that instruction was to give three people a call. The first was Mick Dodson, who was then the Social Justice Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner.
That's right.
And he'd only been in that role for a few years. The second person I called was Luigi O'Donoghue, who was the chair of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, ATSIC, which no longer exists. And Robert French, who was then the president of the National Native Title Tribunal. And I had a discussion with each of them and said, what should a body like the Planning Institute be doing in this space? And they all gave pretty much the same answer. And that was that we shouldn't be meddling in the policy space, that we should be doing. I mean, the question they asked was, what are you doing to advise your members of their obligations under the Native Title Act? And I thought for a minute and said, nothing. We haven't done anything.
Interesting.
And they said, well, that's what you should be doing. So with the help of ICIP and the Native Title Tribunal in particular, we then set about I also found that John Sheehan, within the valuers, were trying to do exactly that. And they, and look, you know, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, planners are better at process than valuers. So, and given my experience up to that point, I had developed a knack. I've never trained as a lawyer, but I had developed a knack of being able to dissect legislation and to take a fresh look at it and recreate it in a way that users can understand it. And I'd done that particularly in the context of the leasehold system in Canberra for several years before that, for more than a decade, or 2 decades even by that stage. So that's what I did. I sat down with people from the tribunal and from ATSIC, and we developed a set of guidance notes for our members. Went back to the board and told the board what had been suggested to me by those 3 eminent people. Got a bit of resistance from the board initially, but I persisted. And then we were ready to release them in early December 96, but the then president of the Institute wanted to go through a convoluted consultation process with the members, which I thought was entirely unnecessary, given that we'd been aided and assisted and guided by eminent lawyers in both the Native Title Tribunal and in ATSIC. And Mick Dodson from the Human Rights Commission had also had a look at what we drafted and said it was all okay. I didn't see the need for that. Anyway, it postponed the release of that document. In the meantime, of course, the Wick decision was handed down by the High Court on the 23rd of December 1996. And John Sheehan was really keen to release the guidance notes that we had. So I literally pushed the Institute to agree that the valuers wanted to go it alone, but we put a lot of work into this with John, and we didn't want to lose the significance of the joint bodies having produced a very significant piece of work.
Absolutely.
And so then we decided to release it on Australia Day in 1997. It got national press coverage. Here were 2 white males in white shirts, suits, white Caucasian males in suits and shirts and ties saying, what's all the fuss about? Because this is the process you've got to follow under the Native Title Act. And we had, in the guidance notes that we'd produced, we'd unpacked the Future Act process under the Native Title Act as it had been drafted in 1993.
The practice notes for non-Aboriginal practitioners?
Indeed. Practice notes for planners and valuers. These are the things you need to be doing under the Native Title Act if you're working in an area where native title exists or may exist. It was a pretty simple document, frankly, because the Future Act process in the Native Title Act was not complicated at that point. Then, of course, Howard produced the 10-point plan, and there was an 18-month period where there was a lot of debate about how the Native Title Act should or shouldn't be amended. And, of course, Howard produced the 10-point plan without consultation with all the interests, only with 2 segments of interest, the pastoralists and the miners, and probably the states, and put it on the table and said, that's what we want. It then took a long time to get through this through the Parliament. And then, of course, when it finally was, I resigned as an employee of the Planning Institute after the release of that document because I did not want to go down a racist route. What had become very evident to me was that some people in the Planning Institute were too wedded with what had involved in the Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory. You've got to remember that the Land Rights Act in the Territory was shepherded through the Parliament by the Fraser government. The process was kicked off by work that the Whitlam government had done, but when Whitlam lost office, that passed. Fraser, of course, had pegged his political future in the Commonwealth about fighting racism in South Africa and other parts of the Commonwealth. So he could hardly be racist at home. So he, with his imprimatur, shepherded the Land Rights Act through the Parliament in 19 1976. But two of the compromises that evolved through that process in the Land Rights Act was that no claims could be made in towns and cities, and a sunset clause was introduced. Well, common law native title is a common law right. You can't do those things to a common law right. It's simply not possible to say no claims in towns and cities, because that's not the way the Mabo decision had been determined or the way the Native Title Act had been framed.
Absolutely.
It's a pre-existing common law right, and you can't put a sunset clause on it. So those two elements were just simply never going to happen, no matter, even though the Howard government had included the sunset clause in its 10-point plan. That didn't get up, by the way. The whole of the 10-point plan didn't get up. And again, that was partly due to actions by John Sheehan and I at the 11th hour, when the Native Title Indigenous Working Group had walked out on Senator Brian Harradine's decision to support the 10-point plan.
Yeah, really.
John Sheehan and I then went back to Harradine's office, and we waited for him until fairly late in the night.
Yeah, wow.
And it was only when he was going to come out and go home that we marched him back in his office and said, "You can't pass this through the Parliament. The High Court will make a mockery of you."
Yeah, wow.
So that's why the time limits on native title claims never eventuated, although it was in the 10-point plan. Anyway, I had resigned from the Institute as an employee, but not as a member, because I didn't want the Institute to go down what I saw then as a racist route. And I fought pretty hard for that not to happen. But having resigned from the Institute, a colleague of mine was working as Chief Executive of the Australian Local Government Association, and he cottoned on very fast that if any sector was going to be significantly impacted by the native title, any non-Aboriginal party or non-Indigenous party that was going to be significantly impacted by the Native Title Act, it was going to be local government, because local governments are essentially land managers in many ways. Absolutely. Whether they own the land or not. They make decisions about land use, they make decisions about land management. Some of it is within their control, some of it's not entirely within their control, but they do the work. And a lot of things they do are potentially future acts under the Native Title Act. So I was snapped up by the Australian Local Government Association to produce two documents. One was a working out agreements guide, because the amendments to the Native Title Act had strengthened the agreement provisions in the Act, and the other one was to produce a guide for local government on how to work with native title. So we had to wait for the amendments to go through the Parliament, and then when they did, we spent 6 months basically up on the top floor of the Australian Local Government Association with a young lawyer named Lucy McMillan, who worked with me for 6 months to cut the Act up, and we laid it out on the floor of the offices and recreated it and developed a 6-step action plan for local government. And then we turned that into a training program, which I then hawked around the country. I think there were about 700 councils in existence at the time, and I think I probably visited about 500 of them. Yeah, wow. Given that the process was Commonwealth funded by the Tribunal and by ATSIC and by Federal Attorney General's Department, the modus operandi that I adopted with the support of the ALJ executive was that when we were doing training workshops for local government, the invitations had to be extended to the local Aboriginal people or their representatives to be there as well, or to participate. Of course, there was a bit of resistance initially, but
I can imagine. The 90s still?
Oh, yes. Late 90s, 1999, and then early 2000s. Yeah. Because the amendments to the Native Title Act, as I said, didn't get through until about October 1998, I think. October 1998. It was pretty late in the year. Yeah. And it took us about 6 months to then produce the guide. And in those days, we didn't produce it on the net. We didn't want the copyright stolen or misused, so we didn't put it on the net. And councils had to purchase a copy, and we would go out and train them. And what that prompted me to do was, which is something I'd done before in my previous roles in other contexts, but not in this particular context, was that the Native Title Act was a federal act, but we were producing a guide for every jurisdiction around Australia. So that meant that I had to go through every local government act, every land administration act, every planning act, every environmental management act, every heritage act, every Aboriginal land rights and Torres Strait Islander statutory land rights act around the country. Not that I hadn't done this before, but it prompted me to develop a pretty sound understanding of the differences between those statutes around the country and how a native title might play out differently in different jurisdictions. The one element we didn't explore in that work was the mining industry, because mining is not a matter that local governments have a say in. So we didn't look at it from the resource extraction perspective, but we certainly did look at it from the point of view of pastoralists and agriculturalists changing land use on leasehold tenures, because that would need to go through the local government planning processes in most jurisdictions, not all.
Definitely. How do you see it sitting today with where we're at with native title today, based on that journey so early in the experience?
Look, I've never been able to walk away from this space. That experience of going around working with local governments, trying to teach them, generated quite a bit of work. I then was able to set up my own practice, which was essentially preparing parties for negotiations, for agreement negotiations by the tribunal, because at those days, in the early 2000s, the Native Title Tribunal played a pretty heavy role in facilitating negotiations. And also, what I was doing with my work was helping local governments develop a relationship with the relevant native title representative bodies for the jurisdiction, and also to work with local Aboriginal groups and develop a better relationship. What I found through those workshops that when I often brought, the modus operandi I'd adopted brought local council community members and other leaders together with the local Aboriginal people. What I discovered was that these people knew each other anyway through church connections, sporting connections, school connections. The fundamental difference between local government and state government in the native title context is that at the local government scale, the local communities interact with their local Aboriginal community. The state's not necessarily so. So I was often saying to councils, you need to join a native title claim, but you don't necessarily need to be sitting at the table if the claim goes on appeal from the federal court to the High Court, because there are matters of legal principle being sorted out by the High Court, and you don't need to be. You don't necessarily need to be at that table at that point. You can take a step back, let the High Court sort out the legal principles and the disputes with the state, but you have to get on with building bridges with your local community. It's best for you to be trying to play a conciliatory role rather than an adversarial role.
Absolutely. With your work,
but I didn't answer your question about your question was about what I think about the Native Title Act. Well, I was asked that question recently by a couple of traditional owner groups, and I said, well, if you could give me a blank sheet of paper, I'd start again.
Yeah.
Look, it's got its pluses and minuses. Look, we've recently had a debate around constitutional change, which was unsuccessful for a whole host of reasons. But ever since what the Native Title Act did was to change the game. It was the first time that Aboriginal people finally got recognition of their land rights in one form or another. And the Commonwealth had to create the Native Title Act as a way of systematising it, because if it didn't, all those claims would have had to have been considered by the High Court. Yeah. And you can't have the High Court as the judiciary, as the judge making the decision, and also then any appeals. So you had to lower the responsibility in this legal system somewhere. So it created a role for the federal court, and of course for the Native Title Tribunal, more at an administrative role these days. But having said that, what's happened since 1992 is that instead of, there's been a recognition that Aboriginal people have some kind of legal interest in land through the native title system, and now to more than 50% of Terra Australia and 20% of offshore waters that are the Commonwealth responsibility through the native title system. So despite the fact that we've tried, that Aboriginal people have tried to change the constitution in terms of recognition through our principal founding document as a British nation, as a British colony, into a nation. We've had this quiet revolution going on in the background, as John Altman calls it, a land title revolution going on. So that, and that was the other reason why I could see this coming. Even 30 years ago, I could see this coming, and that was why in 1997, after I left working for the Planning Institute, I wrote 3 papers which were published by the Australia Institute. One of those papers foreshadowed what I co-authored with John Sheehan, and we both had separate chapters in the document, one looking at from the valuers profession perspective and the other one from the planning perspective. And in the part of the book that I wrote, the paper that I wrote, I concentrated on the fact that we needed to change, that the Institute needed to change the way it educates its planners, that Aboriginal people now have a legal right that needs to be recognised in the planning system, and that we need to begin rewriting the planning statutes. That paper, I wrote that 30 years ago. Mind you, it took the Institute another 20 years to actually change their education accreditation policy to include Indigenous knowledges as a learning area for planners. That didn't happen until 2017. That was a pretty difficult journey.
Yeah, I bet. I bet. A lot of pushback along the way to get to where you got to with that.
Yeah, one of the things that Robert French and one of his colleagues at the Tribunal said to me a very long time ago, a guy called Tony McRae, he said, Ed, this is going to take a generational change. And it certainly has.
Yeah, well, I think, in the context of the start of that yarn around your journey in this sort of space to where we're connected now with some of the stuff that we're doing with the Planning Institute and things like that, you can really see that. I mean, it has been 25 plus years since that work in a lot of ways.
I've just completed an Ahuri research project called I can't remember the full title of the final document. I'm sorry, but it was around Indigenous voices in the urban policy space. And I did this work with my colleagues Ellie Davidson and Libby Porter, Annie Landau Ward from RMIT, and Don McNeil and Ellie Davidson from University of Sydney, and my colleague Matt Kelly from UNSW. Ellie and Libby led the research in terms of engaging with the traditional owner groups in both Sydney and Melbourne. But Matt Kelly and I took a deep dive into the statutes and policy documents governing the urban policy space and the Aboriginal policy space, so to speak. In New South Wales and in Victoria. We did that at the international level. We looked at the national level because there are a whole lot of both international and documents and national documents that play into this space as well. And then we took a deep dive in both New South Wales and Victoria. One of the things that we did in looking at those documents was to map the sequence of documents across a timeline from around about the late 90s through to the present, because of course you post the Native Title Act of 1993. And the timeline is not really well populated until you get to the last 5 or 6 years or so.
Yeah, interesting.
And then there's a whole lot of documents. So in New South Wales, for example, we've seen the design for country and the other one that was done for the Aerotropolis, for example.
That's right.
In Victoria, we've seen the Victorian government go down the treaty route since 2016 by putting self-determination at the top of the policy agenda across the board in Victoria, not just in relation to urban policy, but in relation to the treaty journey, because that's what the Aboriginal people asked for when Dan Andrews asked them back in 2016. And so we've seen a significant shift. In the end, I mean, we looked at probably around 1,500 documents initially. We narrowed that down to about 400 to 500 documents. And in the end, we narrowed it down to about 150 documents for Victoria and about 100 documents for New South Wales. And they're all summarised and catalogued. And we tried to map the interactions. And then the question that we put to Libby and Ellie was, well, how do Aboriginal people, and in particular traditional custodians and traditional owners, navigate this space, this policy legislative space?
Absolutely.
And does it result in benefits for them at the end of the day? They're imponderable questions.
Where'd you get to, or where did they get to in this part of that process?
The report's now been released, so you can read it on the web. We found that that's a very difficult space for Aboriginal people to navigate because it's a clash of two cultures. This is an intercultural contact zone between a Western system and an Indigenous system of worldviews and values and knowledges, and the two are not necessarily compatible. It's not about packing up and going home on the H-Embark Endeavour, but it is about building a better future together by listening more deeply and accommodating worldviews, particularly Indigenous worldviews and values, better in what we do in terms of urban policy and development.
We've seen a big move in New South Wales particularly, but I mean even federally as well, around Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, and particularly in New South Wales in the planning space, I guess more attention into those inherent rights for Aboriginal communities around knowledge and around how that informs planning and design. And I don't know, I think, I feel sometimes that the recognition of those inherent rights is almost a mechanism for agency in the planning and engagement in the planning and design journey alongside government. Because that's the friction, right? The friction is the intersection between the Western and community lens or cultural lens and how they speak to each other. I feel like ICIP as a journey that we're sort of seeing at a federal level is giving our communities some agency to try and navigate those sort of experiences. Still somewhere to go though, I think.
Well, it's interesting you raise that point. A couple of comments. What we did find at the end of the process was that in 2023, both Victoria and New South Wales in the planning space were beginning to unpack that space about ICIP, Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property Rights. And both states had engaged my dear colleague Terry Janke from Terry Janke and Co. To do some work. In the case of New South Wales, they did produce a guide for navigating the ICIP space in relation to planning. That had just been released, I think, December 2023, I think. And the Victorian document, they did one on data sovereignty, but it seems to have, in the rehash of machinery of government changes that followed Daniel Andrews' departure from politics in Victoria, that document seems to have disappeared off the system somewhere. Okay. So we're still trying to find it. But yes, I was very lucky through the course of my PhD at ANU to be studying alongside Terry Janke. So I watched Terry produce her PhD off the back of a lot of work that she had already done in that space through her career.
And did your PhD together alongside each other?
Alongside each other, yes, through the National Centre for Indigenous Studies at ANU. And we both graduated at the same time.
Oh, unreal.
Yes.
Terry's a legend. I sat on a panel with her last week for the Festival of Urbanism at Sydney Uni. Yeah, she's unreal.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
Yes. The work she's done in relation to developing the True Tracks framework has been absolutely remarkable. And her book is a joy to read, an absolute joy.
Absolutely.
It tracks her journey. Yeah. There's still a lot more work to do in that space. And there is a lot of work being done by IP Australia. There's been certainly some discussion about improving the legislative framework. I mean, I can't speak in detail here. Terry's on top of this far more than I am. But I admire her tenacity and I admire the vigour and the rigour that she brings to her work. And she certainly has. In the absence of legislation, she's developed the True Tracks framework, which I think has a very significant role to play in the planning space. These things need to be negotiated at the traditional owner level. These are not things that we can take for granted. The other alarm bell that rings for planners is that we need to be very mindful of the bounds of cultural appropriation. I'm a non-Indigenous person. I can't speak for Indigenous culture. It's all very well for us to say as non-Indigenous people that we need to take Indigenous knowledges and culture into account.
Yeah.
But we can't do that without the free, prior and informed consent of the holders of that knowledge.
Absolutely.
And that's not a one-off negotiation. That's a constant negotiation. That's a constant process.
Very important point.
And whilst some legislation in this space might be helpful, it's a bit like the agreement process in the Native Title Act. The Act provides for an agreement framework, but it's not over-prescriptive. And I would hope that the same applies in the ICIP space, that the legislation provides a level of greater protection than it currently does, but allows some flexibility on the ground between the knowledge holders and those that are seeking to apply that knowledge who may not be Indigenous.
Yes.
And that's there are no simple answers to cultural appropriation. It's one that requires careful listening, deep respect, and really solid negotiations.
I think you really sort of pin that down pretty clearly for a lot of people listening, particularly non-Aboriginal practitioners that are working in this sort of space. And I think, I forget the word or language that you used to describe it, but that it being an ongoing process in terms of access to knowledge.
Yep.
And I think that's one thing that's definitely resonated and that we've seen, particularly around whether it's the ICIP space or cultural engagement more broadly, is there is a real complexity around who has rights to speak. You know, discrepancies in community or in family groups around stories and places and different things like that. And so there's even a real complexity around access to knowledge and what processes look like around what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, who holds the rights around continuing to determine that is that is accessible, if that should change over time, and different things like that. That's one thing that we've definitely seen, and that we really try and encourage, is to think less around that sort of stuff from a transactional perspective in terms of access to knowledge, but more as maintaining an ongoing relationship with people who speak for that, around understanding that what's being done is appropriate, is proper, and in line with, you know, protocols for community and for country. It's a shift, and it's an investment, but it's one that if we can get it right, you know, we really make sure that we're building together and designing together in a way that is the most culturally strong as we progress forward. But I think one we probably wrestle with the most as practitioners in the public and private sector, because we are so used to, you know, working in a transactional sort of sense, whereas we know at a community, local and cultural level that it's very much the opposite in a lot of ways as well. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's an evolving space.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I've just written, I've just had 2 chapters published in a book about human research ethics.
Yeah. Okay.
My colleague Bruce Smythe from ANU, who was very helpful to me during my PhD journey, called me about a year or so ago and invited me to write a chapter for a handbook on research ethics, human research ethics in Australia, that had been contracted to write for Routledge. Yeah, okay. And the book has just been published. And he said to me, Ed, when you write, he wanted me to write about my PhD ethics journey, because I'd had an interesting journey getting ethics approval for my PhD research with 2 communities in the West. He said, I want you to write about your journey. And I said, okay. He said, but when you do, he said, you've got to refer to 2 documents. He said, you've got to refer to the national statement, the Aboriginal chapter in the National Statement on Human Research Ethics, and you've got to refer to the ASIS Code, which was still at that point a guideline. Yep. So when I sat down to write the chapter, I thought, hang on a minute, there's a whole lot of other guides and protocols that apply in this space, both at the international level and the national level. So what I did instead was to write a chapter around what all those documents are, how they link together or don't link together, and in what kind of context they apply. So instead of writing the chapter that he wanted me to write, I wrote this chapter which mapped out all the international documents that apply to human research ethics in Australia, and then, of course, the Australian ones that apply as well. And I think there is about 20 documents. So if you're a researcher in this space, it's difficult to navigate. So the purpose of writing that chapter was to draw attention to the complexity and to try and make it a bit easier. So I handed it up to Bruce and I said, here you go. I said, here's my chapter. I said, it's not quite what you asked for, but I'm sure you won't knock it back. And he was just gobsmacked. He said, we hadn't even thought of that when we were writing the book. Then he turned around and he said, well, Ed, I still want you to write the chapter about your experiences about your research ethics, which I then did as well. But the book has got a segment in it on research in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space, and there are 5 chapters in that section. One of the other chapters is written by Terry Janke on the true tax process that she's developed, on the true tax principles. And there's a chapter about the ICIS code written by a couple of colleagues at ICIS who manage the code. And there's a chapter by Mandy Downing from Curtin University, which introduces the suite of chapters in that section of the book.
Yeah, okay.
And my two chapters fit in that section of the book.
Great.
My chapter about my research experience talks about those fundamentals around, well, how do we as non-Indigenous researchers engage with Indigenous peoples? What are the bounds around that? What are the rules? You can write a set of rules and guidelines, which are in the suite of documents that I've documented in the previous chapter, but what actually happens on the ground?
Yeah.
And how do you navigate that space? And the two things that struck me, and in the context of other work that I've been doing around Indigenous human rights, UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is the key document. When you dissemble the 46 articles in UNDRIP, you realise that many of them are statements of fact around the rights that Indigenous peoples can draw. And all of those rights are already reflected in other conventions and covenants that the UN has endorsed. But the two things that stand out in that document are the two mechanisms by which it can be implemented, and they are self-determination and free, prior and informed consent. So when it boils down to doing research with Indigenous peoples by non-Indigenous peoples, we need to have front and centre in our mind self-determination and free, prior and informed consent. Have the Indigenous people self-determined that they want to participate in your research?
Yes.
And do you have their free, prior and informed consent?
Yeah.
And by free, prior and informed consent, we unpack what that means. And the Human Rights Commission actually produced a wonderful community guide to UNDRIP back in 2010, which I still continue to point people to because it sets out the rules around what free, prior and informed consent really means in practice.
Absolutely.
And so they're the key mechanisms that we as researchers and practitioners should always keep in the back of our minds, well, at the forefront of our minds when we're working with Indigenous peoples. We have to respect their right to self-determination. If they determine, even partway through a process, to withdraw, we have to respect that.
Absolutely.
We can't. That's non-negotiable.
Absolutely.
If a community or an individual chooses not to participate, that's their right, and you can't transgress that right. And with free, prior and informed consent, it's about identifying the right people. It's about identifying their cultural authority. It's about understanding the extent of that cultural authority. It's about developing long-term relationships and respect and building trust.
It's so valuable how you narrow it down to those two core principles around self-determination and free, prior and informed consent. And I feel like so many people that are listening and watching this, that will really resonate and add a lot of value, because we're recently having a conversation at Sydney University with their School of Justice there, and they were talking about the complexities and challenges around the ethics journey, particularly for a lot of their PhD students. And, you know, without going into detail around a lot of that sort of stuff, I think what you talk to really adds so much value for what people can take away in terms of where to really focus in on understanding and navigating to get through that journey. You know, we know that there's AH&MRC and IATSA sort of ethics processes as part of that broad journey as well. And many students on their PhD journeys are trying to navigate and struggle through that. But I think what you talked about at the end of that reflection around that, again, that investment into relationships with community and connections and ongoing relationships with community is really going to benefit being able to do that work and do that work well for the long term as well. Yeah, I think that's what's going to really strengthen the ability to navigate a lot of that stuff.
Based on mutual respect and trust.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The what I should do is acknowledge one of my colleagues who came forward to me in the mid-90s, a man called Roger Davis, who was a planner in Queensland. He was working for the Central Queensland Land Council at the time. Roger was the person who said to me very early in the piece, this is all about human rights, Ed. He said, and this was, you've got to remember that UNDRIP was only in draft form in the mid-90s. Its development had started in the 70s and 80s, and there had been a long period of development, of course, at the international level. And by the mid-90s, it had been drafted and it was sitting in abeyance. I think in about 1995 or 96, it had gone to not quite the General Assembly, but it was ready to go. But many countries were concerned about the rights to self-determination in Article 3 of UNDRIP, because they saw that as a threat to their nation status.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just coming from the Kansas countries, this was also coming from countries in Africa and also the Scandinavian countries because of the Sami people. I had the good fortune of actually being able to work for Mick Dodson in the early 2000s for about 9 months. And that was the point at which Mick was heavily involved with the final stages of UNDRIP and trying to get Indigenous people and nation states to find a resolution. And of course, what eventuated was Article 46, which puts a limit on the extent to which self-determination can only be pursued within a nation-state context. This is to prevent Scandinavia being broken up by the Sami people, for example. Yeah. And also, of course, the Aboriginal people in Canada and the American Inuits in America and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. But it was Roger Davis who drew my attention to the fact that it's the human rights framework that's really important. Yeah. And I've never forgotten that statement. The whole way through my journey in this space, I've said we have to put human rights at the forefront. If we don't put human rights at the forefront, this is not going to go anywhere.
Absolutely.
And once UNDRIP was endorsed by the General Assembly in 2007, opposed by the 4 Kansas countries, of course, but all of whom have changed their minds since then, it becomes a very important document. It's a declaration. It's not legally binding in the same way that countries are asked to ratify conventions or covenants, but it's because it's a statement of principle. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen. This is it. This is the minimum expectation that Indigenous people have of non-Indigenous people. This is the way we want to be treated. This is the way, these are the minimum rules. And like I say, when you unpack the 46 articles and you look at them individually and then you look at them collectively, you soon realise that the principles of self-determination and free, prior and informed consent are embedded in several articles throughout the Declaration as the vehicle for its implementation. Now, Australia is one of the nations that's dragging the chain. Most other nations around the world have adopted UNDRIP into their constitutions or into their domestic laws. Australia, and as one of the laggards in this space, a really important laggard. Of course, we often look to the other Kansas countries, and America is no example in this space either. Canada has adopted UNDRIP into domestic law, and in particular the province of British Columbia have adopted it into domestic law. Australia hasn't. New Zealand was going down that path, but with the recent change in government in New Zealand, we've seen the backing in the other direction. The other observation I would make is that 3 states in Australia have human rights acts, and that's Victoria, Queensland and the ACT. And each of those human rights acts make reference to UNDRIP. They also make reference to the fact that the court has the discretion to rely on international human rights law to interpret the act. So 3 jurisdictions already have UNDRIP sitting on the table as a code that's been written into their domestic law. So there's no reason why Australia couldn't or shouldn't, at the federal level, adopt UNDRIP into other statutes.
Absolutely.
And this is important for the treaty process in Victoria too, of course. And we've got to remember that when Daniel Andrew went to the Aboriginal people in 2016, he asked them what they wanted, and they said they want a treaty, but they want it based on the principle of self-determination. And so what's been able to drive the process in Victoria has been the fact that self-determination has been the principle that's been on the table for that process.
Absolutely. So, UNDRIP's funny, I got a acknowledgement in UNDRIP in the artwork.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I didn't realise the significance of it till so much later in my personal, professional journey looking back at it. But we were involved in Glebe as part of a community group that designed the artwork for the document. So if you go on the inside of the document, there's an acknowledgement section, and you'll see my name and a few other mob from Glebe that were involved in the art work behind there. Small connection.
Was this for the UN or for the Human Rights Commission?
Human Rights Commission one, yeah.
Wow. I will go and have a look.
Yeah, I'll shoot you a link to it.
You know, I took my copy to one. I teach at the University of New South Wales. One year I took my hard copy of the community guide into the class and it disappeared.
Oh, yeah?
So I put a note out to my students, with the person who borrowed it, please return it. It turned up back in the post one day.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh,
Luckily
good.
I got it back.
Hey, that might be a nice segue, because I'd love to hear about, clearly for anyone listening, they're going to really understand, I guess, the depth of your career and journey in this sort of space, where we've been in a generation to where we are now, but the impact, I guess, that you're now having as well through academia and through teaching with the next generation of planners coming through. And I guess I'd love to hear a little bit about that, particularly for people that are listening that maybe missed out on that opportunity as part of their learning and educational journey in the sector. But to hear a little bit about that, your priorities in that sort of space, or what you think are some of the most core things that the next generation of planners need to learn or are learning, and just a general sort of thinking and reflection around that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and that was a long journey too. When I wrote that paper in 1997, that was published by the Australia Institute about what the impact of native title is on planners and valuers, Lex Brown from Griffith University rang me and said, well, Ed, I'm going to throw down the gauntlet and say to you, why don't you develop a course that we can include in our environmental and planning program, and we'll get you to deliver it as well. So I did. I wrote a full semester course, which I then delivered at Griffith University for about 4 years, from about 1999 to about 2004.
Yeah, wow.
And I had to travel back and forth pretty much every couple of weeks or every week for a 10-week period. That was pretty transformative. I do remember, again, tongue-in-cheek perhaps, but I had a mixture of undergraduate and postgraduate students, which meant that I had more mature people in the room.
Yep.
I would ask them in the first class that if they were taught that Captain Cook discovered Australia, I'd like them to write that down on a piece of paper, and there was a garbage bin by the door. You can drop that in the bin, and if you're prepared to drop it in the bin, you can come back. But if you're not prepared to drop it in the bin, then don't bother coming back, because this course is going to change the way you think about this space.
Yes.
I did have a couple of people in the first year who did not come back into the room.
Yep.
I did have others who reluctantly came back into the room and later said to me, Ed, I never knew this. All this stuff, about Aboriginal people and how they were treated and why the Native Title Act came about, the attempts that Aboriginal people had made prior to the Mabo case through the state courts and the federal court or the High Court process to try and gain recognition, what the street marches were all about. They'd never really realised that. So that was pretty transformative.
Absolutely.
After 2004, I couldn't do it anymore. Then it was a while, but in 2012, Sharon Harwood from James Cook University was developing a postgraduate course for students on planning with Indigenous communities up in the northern part of Australia. Not unfamiliar territory to me, by the way. We've done a lot of work in the northern part of Australia in other contexts. And I'd been out to the Torres Strait and up to communities in the Cape York and across northern Australia in many other contexts before. So Sharon invited me to develop one component of a 4-unit course, which would be focused particularly around the Native Title and the Land Rights Acts in Queensland and the Northern Territory, whilst the other 3 components of the course that she was developing as a postgraduate certificate was around actually working with communities around planning and environmental management. So again, developed that course and taught it for 5 years, mostly online, not entirely, but mostly. And again, a mixture of postgraduate students and undergraduate students. And then in 2017, once the Planning Institute changed their accreditation criteria, I'd had a long association with UNSW. I'd never studied at UNSW, but because I'd known Hans Westerman, who ended up becoming the Director of Town Planning at UNSW, I'd been a guest lecturer at UNSW for a long time on various topics. My colleagues at UNSW invited me to develop a course that they could include in the city planning program. So I deliver a course called Planning with Indigenous Peoples, which I've now been doing for 4 years, since 2019. We didn't run it during COVID, couldn't do it. But initially it was a 10-week course. So I'd travel back and forth from Canberra every week. And we'd have the students for 3 or 4 hours one evening. And then for the last 2 years, we've been delivering it in intensive mode, which is what we wanted to do in the first place. So we now have the students for 2 days at a time, 3 times through the term.
Yep.
And we delivered it that way last year, and we're delivering it that way again this year. And the reason why I'm in Sydney is because I've got classes tomorrow and Saturday.
Yeah.
The course is structured around a temporal change. Well, even this late in 2019, we were still finding that students were turning up at university and had very little exposure in their education to the plight of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people generally. So the course begins by unpacking that space. What do you know in this space? Did you grow up with Aboriginal people? Can we begin by looking at, we begin by acknowledgement of country. What does that mean? What's the difference between an acknowledgement and a welcome? Why are they significant? Why have they become significant? Are they well accepted across the community or not? We unpack that space. We then begin to unpack the land rights space. How did we get into this predicament in Australia where we didn't recognise the pre-existence and occupation of this country and ownership of this country by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? What's been the trajectory? So we begin to unpack that space. We certainly look at how the land rights systems evolved and how the native title system evolved. We look at how the media portrays Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people's issues and how to make judgments about that. We then begin to also unpack the native title space in far more detail. And we certainly talk about the policy dilemmas around things like constitutional recognition. What does recognition mean? What are you doing when you recognise someone's rights and interests? And how can that be expressed? We also then unpack the Indigenous engagement space. What does engagement mean? How do you navigate that space as a non-Indigenous person if you're working for a local council or a state government department and you've got to engage with the local Aboriginal community? How do you find out that you're talking to the right people, for example? So we teach them to navigate that institutional space. We teach them about the land council structures. We teach them about native title representative bodies and service providers, prescribed body corporates and registered native title parties and so on. And we invite guests into the classroom, people like the president of the Native Title Tribunal, people like lawyers from the Indigenous rights space and the legal frame. We invite Aboriginal people into the room.
I think Sean McCarthy's coming in as part of one of your sessions too.
Sean's coming in tomorrow.
Oh, great.
And we've been having Blake Cansdale in the classroom as well. And Blake's been with us now for the journey for, I think, 3 out of the 4 years. Initially, we had him in the classroom as a discussant every week for 8 out of the 10 weeks. And so there'd be opportunities for Blake to present. Blake used to work for the Darkinjung Local Aboriginal Land Council, heavily involved in implementing the Aboriginal Land CIP when that process was underway. He's now the director of ANTAR, Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. And this year we've had Blake in the classroom twice. We've also got Blake coming in tomorrow alongside Sean.
Oh, great.
So we try and get as many guests into the classroom as possible. It's not just Matt Kelly and I delivering the course. What I should say, of course, is that Matt Kelly and I developed the course together and we deliver the course together. Look, I'm getting on in age. It's time I hang my boots up.
Pass the baton on.
So I said to UNSW, I need a protege that can follow my footsteps. Matt's doing his PhD, and so we still continue to develop the course together and deliver it together. And I'm hoping that Matt can step into the fray once he's finished his PhD.
That's it. Surely, I'm sure you'll continue to mentor him as part of that journey too. And
sure.
As he picks up those those reins. It's one of those things, isn't it? The educational experience in the planning sort of sector, you know, like one of my biggest learnings was about planning really as a tool of colonisation early in this country's story. You know, particularly for our people, you know, literally like places were planned and built to remove our families and displace us from country and community, often on the outskirts of town, removed from any connection more broader and socially outside of, you know, our people. And so there is a real legacy impact of planning as a colonial system that was, you know, very destructive in terms of its structure and its delivery. And I think for a lot of planners that are listening and people working in that space, it's really important to remember that the system that you're working in was very much used as a tool of dispossession by design. And it's so great to hear about the course that you've designed and delivered and how it sort of really rebalances that. And I think one of the biggest power shifts I'm seeing now is the recognition for Aboriginal knowledge and culture in terms of not just from the social and sort of rights perspective, which is critical and at the core, but also from the strength and the knowledge in terms of how it supports us to really do planning well and to design well and reimagine futures together better. So not just from that perspective around, you know, rights and social, emotional and cultural well-being, but about really navigating some of the more complex sort of urban design challenges we're navigating from a planning perspective today and even regionally as well, and how we really lean into Aboriginal knowledge and culture as a way to add a different lens to how we navigate, you know, how we look to the future in terms of forward thinking and planning. And I think, some of that sort of experience and understanding for the next generation of planners, I think really starts to rebalance understanding the real, you know, we've reflected on in this yarn, the generational journey of how planning intersects and has impacted our people. And I think if they really understand their place within what that system once represented, they can really start to see their part in terms of where it's now going, which could be so much more powerful too. Yeah.
Indeed. I think you touch on a really important point, and that is that Aboriginal people were planners too.
Yes.
You know, we need to recognise that Indigenous peoples owned and managed the country, managed their country, and that the Western planners don't own the concept of planning, which is what Naredi Matunga said from New Zealand many, many years ago. It struck me as being pretty important to understand. So I think, look, the journey has begun. If I look back 20 years, that these sort of things, these conversations weren't being had at all, which is what I was trying to point to. I think I can see that transformational change beginning. I think we're at the beginning of that journey still. We've still got a long way to go. But at least I'm glad I kicked it off.
Absolutely. Played a massive part. Have you got any advice for people listening that are working in this sort of space that are on their own journey professionally and personally, and advice that you might give to them in terms of how to really be a strong ally, really drive change within their areas of influence, anything like that based on your journey?
Good question. Be confident. It's a difficult journey. As a non-Indigenous person, it's a difficult journey. You need to know how to develop respectful relationships with Aboriginal people and communities. And it took me a long time to get that. I copped a lot of resistance initially within the profession, institutionally and personally. You got to be brave. You got to know your convictions and have the courage of your convictions. Look, I gained an awful lot of support from Indigenous elders, people who appreciated the fact that I reached out, people like Mick Dodson, for example, has given me an enormous amount of encouragement. He said to me for a very long time, Ed, you need to come back and do your PhD. But it took me probably 15 years before I decided that it was time to do that in this space. And then I had the good fortune of being able to study under him.
He was your supervisor?
Yes, as my
wow.
principal supervisor. Yes, indeed. Well, that was a great privilege. I'm very grateful for that. I've had lots of support from other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. I think that came from the fact that I had the opportunity to sit through the parliamentary debates around the 1998 amendments to the Native Title Act. I was sitting in the public gallery along people like Pat Dodson, Mick Dodson, Marcia Langton, Noel Pearson. I'm trying to think of the guy from Queensland who headed up FARA for a while. I can't remember his name. It's coming back to me. Les Malzer.
Yes.
And lots of Aboriginal people that I knew, and the fact that John Sheen and I were able to go back in and bat for them when the National Indigenous Working Group basically walked out of Parliament House with their hands up in the air saying, this is just madness. That gained a lot of respect, I think. The fact that I insisted when we were doing the local government training programs that Aboriginal people needed to be invited into the room, I think that earned a great deal of respect because it was the right thing to do at the time. Look, it sticking your head out, being a provocateur, it isn't always easy.
Yep, agitator. Yeah. Look, I think what I hear from a lot of that, which I think some people can take away, is consistency and a bit of courage, and the ability, and the confidence to continue to show up. And I think you're a testament to the fact that that's a journey, and that it's you can't just wake up one day and be having an immediate impact as a non-Aboriginal professional that's passionate. That it takes an investment, some courage, and a real sustained investment in meaningful relationships with our people as well. So I think for anyone's listening that can take some of your story away today, hopefully some of those values really resonate and can inform some of their work and where they go moving on from here. Is there any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with in terms of your journey? And any final messages for anyone listening along?
Look, I've had some amazing feedback from some of the students that I've had through my course. Just gobsmacked sometimes. The students have to fill in 2 surveys at the end of the course, one about the content of the course and the other about the performance of the lecturer.
Yeah.
Of course, there's always been some negative feedback. That's fine.
Always,
we use that to rebuild the course. We've done that every year. We change the nature of it. We change the shape of it. We improve on some of the technical aspects, for example. But there have also been some remarkably warm statements. I mean, for example, last year when we were running the course, it was at the time that the constitutional referendum was on. At the end of the course, many of the students said to me that the course changed the way they vote and gave them confidence to have conversations with their family members and with friends around voting yes, that they would otherwise not have been able to do if you'd wound the clock back 6 months before when they weren't doing this course. So, I'm blessed that I've been able to do that. It does take courage. There's certainly a cost attached, but I wouldn't look back with any regrets, not at all.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you for I guess, a trail that you've blazed and a massive legacy that you've left.
Thanks.
You know, you've talked about this being a generational shift, and despite my generation now sitting here thinking about how much needs to happen, a conversation with you really reinforces how much change has happened as well on the journey to where we're going to from here. And I have to really, you know, sincerely thank you for your energy, your investment, and your time and legacy too. So thank you so much for making the time to sit with me and share some of that story. And
Thanks.
yeah, it means a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed.